Hello all, I'm CJ Werleman and this is episode number 27 of Foreign Object. As you all know, I'm still a relative newcomer to the United States. Having lived here for nearly 3 years, I still consider myself fresh off the boat. I often feel like a babe in the woods when it comes to understanding the American psyche, or should I say, conflicting schizophrenic personalities. The personality I fell in love with as a child of the 70s was the one we know as the 1960s. To this day, I lament my generation has never experienced a transformative agent for social change like characters such as MLK, JFK, or Malcolm X. Yes, you can call me a romantic. What was real social activism 4 to 5 decades ago has been replaced with hashtag activism today. We click like to a Facebook post and delude ourselves into believing that we helped affect change or correct social inequalities. You haven't. You clicked a mouse. Yes, I am cynical, but the Black Lives Matter campaign has given me a little reason to be optimistic for the future, for we have seen real civil rights leaders emerge from this fledgling movement. One of those leaders is my guest today. Linda Sarsour is a civil rights activist and executive director of the Arab American Association of New York and the National Advocacy Director for the National Network for Arab American Communities. Last year, Linda walked 250 miles in 8 days from Staten Island in New York to Washington, D.C. in a march to deliver a package of criminal justice reform demands. So how's that for hashtag activism? And not only is Linda ranked as one of the 15 most inspiring women to emerge from the Middle East, she is also recognised by the White House as a champion of change. Linda has played an instrumental grassroots role in including the discrimination and surveillance against Muslims as part of the Black Lives Matter narrative. Linda is here with me to talk about all this good stuff. Linda, welcome to Foreign Object.
Thank you very much, CJ. I just wanted to make a quick correction that March to Justice happened this year. It was actually last month.
Oh.
Started, April 13th.
Okay, you're not the first person to correct me for something stupid I've said. So, that was an exhausting walk. 8 days, was it? 250 miles?
It was 9 days from April 13th to April 21st through five states in the United States.
Wow. And so ended up on Capitol Hill?
Yes, it did.
Okay. And what was that? And what was that criminal justice reform package?
So the package included 3 pieces of legislation. One is called End Racial Profiling Act, which is pretty self-explanatory in the sense that a lot of these police killings and police brutality usually stem from or start from racial profiling, and it basically holds police departments accountable based on require them to provide statistics and data on the people that they stop. The second one is Stop Militarization of Law Enforcement Act, which basically would limit access of local police departments to military equipment, which we don't think local law enforcement agencies need. And the third one is the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, which is kind of a roadblock to the school to prison pipeline that we believe exists in the United States and provides alternative opportunities for juveniles instead of sending them directly through the criminal justice system. So those were the 3 pieces of legislation. Okay, great.
And do you believe the biggest challenge in overcoming that prison pipeline in this country is the fact that the prisons that we're dealing with are now corporations, and these corporations have a lot of political pull on Capitol Hill? The correction was at CCA, which is now listed on the stock exchange. It is the whole privatization and the whole criminalization of poverty. Do you believe that's the biggest obstacle to affecting change?
Mass incarceration in the United States of America is a business, and so is the detention of undocumented immigrants. These corporations are making money off of filled beds, and so when their beds are not filled, they're not getting paid. So as you know, the United States has the largest prison population in the world, and I think as a country, as we call ourselves a superpower, and for us to hold the largest prison population, for me is a bit disappointing. And I think that because the prison system has been privatized and there are people making money off of it, we're treating people as property and not as human beings. And I think that's why our prison systems are so filled.
Yeah, and I guess you've included in that narrative, as I mentioned in my introduction, the plight of Muslim Americans in with the Black Lives Matter narrative. So, why is that so important, do you believe?
So for me, I emerged as an activist in kind of the post 9/11 war on terror, which particularly targeted Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, with very targeted government policies that include special call-in registration for males in our community to come register with the government. It came in the form of unwarranted surveillance, entrapment cases of young Muslim American men in particular. It includes the creation of these, what we call now in the United States, communication management units, which are very high maximum security prisons where people do not have access to anything, media, family, barely a lawyer, that are made up of 85% Muslims when we know that we are less than 1% of the overall population. The profiling at airports, profiling and religious profiling by all levels of law enforcement agencies. So I was doing that work, and then it came to me doing that police reform work in New York City that there were other groups, including Black communities, who were doing police reform work in New York City for decades. And we kind of joined forces, bringing together the anti-stop and frisk movement with the anti-surveillance movement. And we kind of coalesced together to do police reform work in New York City. And we've had a lot of wins. But for me, personally, as a Muslim American and as a mother, my radicalizing moment and that brought me very deeply into the Black Lives Matter movement was the killing of unarmed young man Mike Brown in Ferguson, where I saw a young man get shot who was unarmed. He laid on the streets of his community in the United States of America for 4.5 hours in the hot sun. And then even after that, he did not get any EMT services. And then he was picked up like a bag of rocks and thrown into a back of an SUV. And I saw the lack of dignity that we treated this man in, that we only hear about maybe in third world countries. And that really radicalized me and made me understand that we have a deeper issue in the United States that has been here since the founding of our country, which is racism against Black people, and that the war on terror is just the continuation of many wars that we've waged on poor people and communities of color, and that if we don't win the war of war against racism against Black people, then none of us are going to be able to win any war. So I think Black liberation for me in the United States is liberation for all people, including American Muslims.
Yeah, I find that interesting because, I mean, you're of Palestinian origin, and a lot of people have made the correlation between, the existence or the lives of Palestinians in the ghetto of Gaza to being a Black male living in these urbanized ghettos in America. Rania Kalik, who was on Foreign Object a few episodes ago, in her recent piece, she said if Baltimore was a country in the Middle East, we'd be calling it a dictatorship. So their correlations are stark. And on that surveillance, I want to speak to you about. I wrote a piece titled, which asked the question, has America become an apartheid state for Muslim Americans? And it kind of spoke to surveillance, police harassment, entrapment, and profiling. In that piece, Arun Kundani made the point that in America today there are more FBI agents and informants per Muslim American than there were Stasi agents for East Germans. So for you being a Muslim American, and to that point, what does it feel like to be a Muslim living in America today? Do you feel surveilled and watched?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not only do I feel it, I know for a fact that I'm particularly under surveillance. And my organization that I work in is, as you know, in the summer of 2011, the Associated Press came out with a very daunting investigative reports based on leaked documents from the New York Police Department that basically showed us that the NYPD was engaging in unwarranted surveillance of our community, 250 mosques, leaders, cafes, butcher shops, Middle Eastern restaurants, grocery stores, Muslim student associations. And as part of that investigative report, as it continued to unfold over the course of 2 years, I was able to see my own organization's name in those documents. Specifically, the NYPD, according to a document that we read, wanted to infiltrate the board of directors of my organization. So they were looking for a particular informant that fit a particular profile to actually try to get them on my board. So not only was the NYPD engaging in unwarranted surveillance where they would show up to the mosque mosque and try to listen to conversations and go into the different places that we kind of visit on the daily as Muslims, they were actually trying to get on the boards of private institutions, including mine. And my organization is not a public entity. It's a social service organization. If this informant gets on my board or got on my board, they would have access to financial information. They would have access to client information. They would have decision-making power. So people have to understand that it's not just paranoia that the Muslim community is under surveillance. This is actual fact, and we know for a fact that we are under surveillance by both the FBI and the NYPD, but more so in New York by the NYPD, which has actually a lot more manpower than the FBI.
And how much is this leading to self-censorship? I mean, that's do you feel that Muslim communities feel like they have to remain silent on politics?
Oh, I mean, even me, someone who people see as very vocal on the things that I care about, I'm very skeptical of people who I meet, maybe for the first time that start immediately trying to ask me questions like, so what do you think about, what's happening in I don't know where? Or people who start asking me the minute they meet me, like, who funds your organization? Who are your board members? I'm like, really? Like, you haven't even said hello or good morning and you already want to know that. And it might be innocent questions, but the paranoia, and for me, it's more about psychological warfare. The fact that people do always feel like they're under surveillance, or that the person they're talking to could be an informant. But what it does is it does censor people. Like, there's a lot of people who don't want to discuss politics. They get really wary when people ask them about their political positions on things. We know of Muslim student associations who had signs up in front of their office that said no political discussion beyond this point, in fear of bringing more scrutiny by law enforcement to their Muslim student associations. I know of Muslim student associations who continue to ask, well, we want to do an event, for example, on Syria, but how do we make it not controversial? And I'm like, how can you have an event about Syria that's not controversial? Syria in itself is controversial. Like, there's nothing not controversial about Syria. People who want to do only humanitarian type, relief events and don't want to really discuss issues that matter to them, because so a lot of Muslim student associations will call and get advice about how they could, make an event not controversial. So they'll say, well, I want to do a humanitarian event about Syria, but I want to make sure that it's not political or controversial. And I'm like, how can you have an event about Syria and not make it political or controversial? Because Syria is very political and controversial. So the fact that our students feel like they have to kind of dumb down events and because they're too afraid to be vocal and political in fear that they'll bring more scrutiny by law enforcement, I think is very sad. And as you know, in this country, a lot of the movements have started on college campuses or were fueled on college campuses. So if the Muslim community generation that's on the college campuses feels silenced, then that's a problem. And it should be a problem for all people in the United States, not just for the Muslim community, but it's a particular concern to me and members of our community.
How good are or how sophisticated is law enforcement in infiltrating these communities? Are they clumsy Keystone-like cops, or do you get the sense that they're getting better or more sophisticated at it, or have they backed away a little bit from the initial post 9/11 days?
Me personally, I don't think they're sophisticated at all. I mean, I think what they're doing is looking for a needle in a haystack, and they're actually using a lot of our taxpayer dollars ineffectively. And I'll give you an example. There was a unit that the NYPD had called the Demographics Unit, or AKA the Zone Assessment Unit, where they mapped the entire Muslim community in New York City. And one of the chief heads of the NYPD intelligence, this guy named Chief Galati, actually said publicly in a deposition back in 2012, he said that we did not generate any leads, zero, zippo, no lead. So as the NYPD has been mapping our community and sending out informants in our community, they really haven't generated any leads. They also have something called terrorism enterprise investigations, where they would open an entire investigation on a particular institution, and they call them TEIs. So, for example, one of our mosques had one that started in 2003, and then the NYPD went back in 2009, which is 6 years later, to get an extension on this investigation. And my question has always been, if you haven't found something in 6 years, and if you haven't arrested anyone, if there hasn't been any activity that suggests that this organization is involved in any criminal or terrorist activity, why would you need to come back and get an investigation? And is that what our taxpayer dollars need to, be going toward? So my thing is, the Muslim community, we're not anti-surveillance. If the NYPD has or FBI have credible information that sends you into a store or into an organization, by all means, surveil that institution based on credible information. But what we don't agree with is unwarranted blanket surveillance on people based simply on their faith, ideology, or on their political views. That is something we don't deem acceptable, and we don't think any American should think that's acceptable.
No, especially not when, the threat from right-wing violence is, the FBI has said it's a greater danger to the Homeland Security and a threat from Muslim Americans. And I think somebody in that debate you participated in New York last week made that point. Well, I think it was Wajahat Ali who made that point and said, well, are we going to profile every Southern-looking white guy? But on that point, I had Dr. Max Abrams on here last week, and he's a terrorism theorist, and he said something which kind of shocked me and caught me off guard, especially coming from him. And he knew it would provoke me when he said it, and I'm sure it's going to do the same to you. He said that as, the FBI infiltration and entrapment has been highly effective in the last couple of years. He said, in fact, it's actually led to a number of arrests of ISIS sympathizers. That hit me for six, and I didn't really have a good comeback for that. What's your take on that?
Well, the numbers, CJ, are what I keep hearing is 160 people have either attempted to or have traveled to Syria to join ISIS groups, right? Mm-hmm. Now, no one has been able to really break down those numbers for me. Who are the people that attempted to or not attempted to? What happened to them? Was it just based on the fact that they were traveling to places like Syria and Iraq? So the numbers, they keep throwing out these numbers, and I haven't really heard the kind of justification and who those people are. Now, 160 people, Muslim Americans are about 7 to 10 million people in this country, right? Yep. Depending on what kind of statistics you follow. As you know, the census doesn't always capture religion. But from what I've seen in general, people haven't disputed, like ISP, the Institute for Social Policy Understanding, and others have said numbers like 7 million. Let's just stick with 7 million. Mm-hmm. 160 people out of 7 million people doesn't make me believe that there's an epidemic of Muslims, grabbing their bags and going to Syria to fight with ISIS. So that's number one. I'm not saying it's not a problem at all. Sure. But I also don't believe it's an epidemic, and that our whole country should be held hostage to this idea that young Muslims are just, in the droves, getting on boats and going to like the other part of the world. Now, the other thing that they won't tell you is that 40% of foiled plots over the past 14 years have actually came from tips from the Muslim American community themselves, right? Whether it be from family, whether it be from mosque leaders who've actually called the FBI or other law enforcement agency to provide tips, which would then lead to foiled plots. So they don't tell you that the Muslim community actually are supposed to be the partners and are willing to be the partners. Unfortunately, law enforcement oftentimes treats us as suspects instead of treating us as partners. And this one very interesting case that I think sets an example of how law enforcement works in this country so that people have an idea. There's also a documentary about it called Informants that people can watch. There was a story out in the Islamic Center of Irvine out in California where this informant was sent into a mosque there, that particular mosque, and he started being crazy. Like he started saying, we need to join jihad, and look what they're doing to our sisters and brothers in Afghanistan, and showing people pictures of dead bodies and raped babies. I don't know what he was doing, whatever. Sure. Eventually, the mosque leaders got really concerned, and they were like, this guy doesn't seem right. Like, he seems like a person that could really do this jihad business. We got to call the FBI and put this guy on their radar. So when the mosque leaders at the Islamic Center of Irvine called the FBI and said, look, we got this guy, he really is a concern to us. When the FBI showed up to find out who the guy was, it turned out he was an FBI informant. And that same informant has now joined a lawsuit with the mosque, the Islamic Center of Irvine, against the FBI. So what I'm saying is, oftentimes, not only do the FBI and NYPD and law enforcement agencies send us informants, but sometimes it's not just people quietly listening and trying to gain information. Sometimes they are themselves the agent provocateurs and actually provoking these types of conversations into communities. Of course, I expect people to take responsibility for their own actions, but I'm not going to sit back and say that having agent provocateurs and that there is no such thing as entrapment in this country. I do believe that some of the cases that have been foiled were in fact cases where I believe young men were entrapped, and they were, many of whom were either ex-convicts or people with mental illnesses or other issues that made them vulnerable and susceptible to being entrapped by law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, indeed. Mubin Sheikh, who wrote Undercover Jihadi, and who was an undercover jihadi, well, former jihadi and an undercover jihadi for the Canadian Security Services, I had on here several weeks ago. He said that's exactly what they do. The FBI are the ones who actually do the radicalisation. They pick on people with Muslims with, as you said, mental health problems, and they radicalise them with all this talk, give them the money and the means to carry out a plot where they wouldn't have had the means and the money in the first place to carry out said plot. But that point that you raised, and if we measure ISIS's propaganda by such a low success rate in America, why are American Muslims less responsive to ISIS propaganda than European Muslims?
Because in the United States of America, and I'll be totally honest with you, I think American Muslims are a lot more integrated in American society in general, in comparison to Muslims in Europe. And I've been to Europe many times, different parts of Europe, where I've seen the poverty and the marginalization and the vilification of Muslims in places like France and in places like Germany and places like London. So what happens to communities like this is they become so otherized, right? Mm-hmm. And these young people start feeling like they're not part of that society, that they are the enemy within their own communities, within their own country. And I'm not saying that's a justification to go and join a terrorist group, but it's kind of similar to why young people join gangs, right? And there's a lot, we need to really break down the psychology. Why does a young person anywhere in the world think that it's okay to go join a terrorist group? There has to be somebody that sits down and kind of analyzes this. In the United States, I feel like Muslim communities in general are a lot more integrated. There's a lot more positive atmospheres that we've created as a community in our mosques, in our community centers. There's a lot more alternatives that we're being offered. And that's without me having to go in the community and say, hey, kids, let's do a workshop about why it's not good to be a terrorist. Like, I don't even have to say that. It's being able to provide quality programming to members of our communities, particularly young people. And Muslim Americans in general in the United States, and there's many Muslims, especially those coming from other parts of the world at this moment, who are living in poverty, who are new immigrants, who have a lot of stresses as well. But in general, the Muslim community here is a very affluent community, many doctors, many professionals, many large institutions with resources. So maybe it's the resource thing where I think we're better assimilated. I don't consider myself assimilated. I feel like I'm more integrated. I continue to have pride in my faith and in my heritage, but I am also a proud American, and I have an easier time saying I'm a proud American versus a lot of young French Muslims who are not always as eager to say I'm a proud French, because the way that their government treats them. Mm. Yeah. So I think that might have something to do with it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that definitely has a play. If you look at, let's say, Pakistani immigrants in Britain, well, they're no longer Pakistani, and they're not considered British. So they're from nowhere, and that sense of dislocation makes the ISIS narrative very appealing. But you've sort of touched on where I wanted to take the conversation naturally anyway, and speaking about the atmospherics in America at the moment. How bad has Islamophobia? Is Islamophobia in this country becoming worse as the years progress from 9/11, or is it getting better? And the second part of that question is, why do so many people still believe Islamophobia isn't a thing?
So Islamophobia has gotten way worse, even from days and months, and even in the first few years after 9/11. And people will say, though, that sounds crazy. Well, for example, mosque opposition. I'm born and raised in the United States of America. My family's been here for over 40 years. And my father will tell you, he's like, we've never heard of anyone protesting the building of mosques. And people have been building mosques in this country for, generations. And now we have mosque opposition across the country. We've never heard of elected officials trying to pass legislations that would ban Muslims from practicing their faith fully in the form of what we call now anti-Sharia bills or anti-foreign bills. That never happened a month after 9/11 or even the first few years. That's only been the past couple of years that's happened. And what makes Islamophobia a little bit different than some other types of phobias or racism or bigotry against other communities is that what we believe is bigotry against Arab Americans and Muslim Americans is actually acceptable in this country. You never hear about a pundit on TV or a host of a national television show who says something very derogatory about Muslims ever get any backlash. Like, they don't get fired, they don't get asked to apologize for anything. But if the same host says something that could be deemed anti-Semitic or maybe anti-Black, while anti-Black racism is rampant in this country, people are a little bit more careful about what they say about other communities on the air, right? Because they don't believe we have the political power, and it's just acceptable. We also see elected officials who win elections, right, based on having an anti-Muslim platform. It's like the more anti-Muslim you are, the more money your campaign makes. And we've seen that across the country. And I feel like the Republican Party is a good example. And not to take away any responsibility from the Democratic Party, because they haven't been always 100% perfect. But the Republican Party, particularly in the Tea Party, have really benefited from anti-Muslim bigotry. And then for the people that say Islamophobia is not real, it's because you haven't experienced it yourself. And I'm really tired of people saying things like, you know, anybody that doesn't agree with you or anyone that's a critic of Islam, you know, is being silenced by me. I mean, the Islamophobes are not silent at all. They're actually quite emboldened and quite encouraged to do what they do in this country.
They have mainstream platforms.
Yeah, and I'm like, look, I'm like, just because I'm calling you a bigot doesn't mean you don't have the right to be one. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm just going to keep calling you a bigot. That's all I'm doing. And the other thing that people don't understand about Islamophobia in the United States of America is that it's an industry. It's a lucrative business. It's like Pamela Geller, who many know is one of the more, you know, well-known bigots. She gets paid $200,000 a year. I mean, I'm dedicated myself to social justice work, and I'm getting paid nowhere near that. You know what I mean? So people need to understand that it's in the best interest of these folks to do what they do because they're getting paid to do it. And they basically fearmonger and play off of misinformation and fear of the American people. And they make money. And people are donating by the hundreds, thousands to their organizations. Even private foundations are donating to them. And as you know, there's been reports that have outed these people and the money that they get. So what people have to understand is that, you know, nobody benefits from saying Islamophobia is not real. Let's just say it's real. And just like I will not stand for anti-Semitism, and I will not stand for anti-Black racism, and I will not stand for homophobia, I also expect that my fellow Americans stand up and say, we will not stand for Islamophobia. And that's really what we're asking for. We're asking for just fair and equal treatment, and to be treated as the Americans that we are. There is no one more American and more Brooklyn than I am. You know, I was born and raised here. This is my country. I only have an American passport. Nobody can deport me anywhere. And this is who I am and who I will be. And I just want to be accepted fully of who I am.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's very well said. I mean, these guys, like, you know, particularly like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, they say, well, I'm only being critical of Islam. But then you're saying shut down Muslim schools and, you know, change the constitution to ban, you know, the teaching of Islam in the country. Well, that's Islamophobic. And when you talk about a Eurabian conspiracy theory that there's a conspiracy for Arabs to take over the European continent. Well, that's Islamophobic. That is
that we're all Muslim Brotherhood infiltrating the government. I mean, there is all these conspiracy theories that these Islamophobes use, right? And they even sometimes conflate things that make absolutely no sense. But because some people don't have the knowledge, they accept that, you know, whatever, you know, like they just accept whatever is being told to them. And one of the things that Ayaan Hirsi Ali does is she does this whole thing about like female genital mutilation, which everyone knows and should know that is not an Islamic practice. We don't do that in Syria. We don't do that in Palestine. We don't do that in Iraq. We don't do that in a lot of Muslim countries. Like nowhere in the Gulf do they do that. It's a practice that's been done in places like Egypt and parts of Africa. It's a cultural and not Islamic. So people start conflating these things together. And because people don't know any better, they accept everything that they hear. And, you know, people like Ayaan have called Islam like a death cult. Like, I'm sorry, but that's not being critical of Islam. That's like that's a slander of an entire faith that 1.6 billion people follow. And I always tell people, why are these Islamophobes whose voices are the minority always picked up as the examples of Islam or the reasons why we should be critical of Islam, as if the 1.6 billion people who follow Islam are a bunch of sheep, like just blindly following a faith? And then the interesting things is you'll hear the Islamophobes say things like, moderate Muslims, where are the moderate Muslims? And which I take great offense when people start talking about moderate Muslims, but let's just go with their argument. Where are the moderate Muslims? But when the quote moderate Muslims are speaking out, they say, oh, but they're irrelevant. The real Muslims following the real Islam are ISIS. And I'm just like, really, people, like, they're inconsistent and nobody calls them out on their inconsistencies. And they continue to say that anyone who's a critic of Islam is being, you know, attacked and whatever. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm the one that's being attacked. You know, I'm the one that, I mean, people are online calling me all all sorts of things. I mean, people have dedicated blogs to writing about people like me. Why? Because I'm an American and I speak my mind and I speak truth to power and I'm not afraid of you and I'll say whatever it is that I want to say. And they do the same. So I'm like, why can you do that? But when I do that, then all of a sudden I want to get attacked for it. And I don't mind being attacked for it, but just don't be offended when I'm attacking you for doing the same thing and being a bigot. It's just a very interesting kind of online fights that we continue to have. And I'm just like, let me say what I want. Let's agree that you have freedom to be a bigot and I have the freedom to call you a bigot. That's all I'm saying. Don't keep doing what you're doing. No one's telling the Islamophobes not to do what they do. But we want to make it clear and educate the American public that these people cannot be left to tell the story of American Muslims, especially the ones who are non-Muslim. Most of the Islamophobes are actually not Muslim at all. So that's the weird thing. It's like, why would you believe a non-Muslim? Like, I'm not going to go believe like some atheist who's going to tell me about Catholicism. Like, I would want to hear about Catholicism from a Catholic. That would make sense to me and seem logical, but it doesn't seem logical to the Islamophobes.
No, because confirmation bias has no religion, as Move and Shake told me on here. It was interesting. You were on Fox News and a well-known Islamophobe called you dangerous because you had the indecency to say moderate Muslims are not terrorists. I mean, how do you keep your cool when someone confronts you with just that kind of breathtaking ignorance?
I mean, for me, I've had a lot of practice doing this, but what I found that really, really sets off the Islamophobes and why they target me, and I'm kind of on one of their hit lists, is because they cannot fathom that there is an articulate, young, American Muslim, nice looking young lady with a Brooklyn accent who is not intimidated, who's not afraid, and will take them down. I mean, I will take any opportunity to take down an Islamophobe. And what they want me to do, which I don't give them the satisfaction of, is they want me to be this angry Muslim woman that's on the defensive. And I have nothing to defend, right? I have points to make and I have positions that I will put forth, and that's what drives them crazy. So they want me to go crazy. They want me to scream and yell. And I basically keep my cool because I'm from Brooklyn and that's what we do here. And really, I will tell you that, yes, I do get attacked after those interviews by some folks. But in general, most folks actually give me great feedback and they say, I really, enjoyed your perspective. I wish I had more Muslim friends. I wish I lived in a place where I can meet more Muslims. And that's the kind of, and I even get things that are a little more shallow that I enjoy, where people will say, I love that color hijab that you were wearing, or I love that thing that you were wearing on your head, or your, eyeshadow was so nice. And even if people forgot that I was saying some really important things, but there are things and ways that I relate to people that drives the Islamophobes crazy. I'm American. I'm a mother. I can talk about contemporary, pop culture. I'm also aligned with other movements. One of the things that drives the Islamophobes crazy right now is that they are literally having a heart attack, that people like myself have found alignment and solidarity within the Black Lives Matter movement. And the last thing that they want to see is communities of color in the United States getting together and working together. And it's actually been, I think, the most, the biggest obstacle to the Islamophobes is coalition building and solidarity amongst groups, so that we're all working together and build a force against all these folks. As you know, Islamophobes are also, and most often, anti a lot of other things that are not just Muslim. So it's good to get people together. So I just keep my cool. I smile. I smirk at them. Because for me, to be honest with you, like, I treat them as a joke, because they are a joke. Unfortunately, they just have very big platforms and a lot of PR and a lot of money.
And so, and how do we? I mean, the piece that I wrote for Middle East Eye last week, which was in response to the Pamela Geller incident. I called for, like we call on the West calls on the Muslim world to marginalize its religious extremists. My piece was a plea for the secular West to, marginalize its secular extremists. How do we marginalize these secular extremists? I mean, we've seen what secular extremism looks like in France. And it's no coincidence that the number one recruiting territory for ISIS is the country of France. Most recruits have come from there, and it's because of, and you can blame that on secular fundamentalism. Is America? I mean, religion is more enshrined in the Constitution here, but do you feel like America is going down that path with, following the Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the Richard Dawkins lead, where it's becoming a secular fundamentalist state?
Definitely, I will definitely give us credit as the United States. I definitely don't think we're anywhere near France, thank God, but I do think that we could potentially get there if we don't actually kind of stand up and say this is not acceptable right now. I mean, it's very simple what we're asking people to do, and it's, number one, mainstream media I do call on mainstream media and say, why do you give platforms to people like Pamela Geller? I'm more than happy with people who are critics, thoughtful critics of Islam, if we want to have a theological debate, ideological debates with people in academia. But knowing people, I mean, Pamela Geller has been deemed, her organization has been deemed a hate group, right? Like, this is not just a lady, that deserves to have these mainstream platforms to spew misinformation and hate. But I also ask, if you don't want to do that because you believe that's censorship, then make sure that we're having equal time for American Muslims to be able to stand in their own voice. Oftentimes, I'll see panels of people on TV talking about Islam and talking about ISIS, but there are no Muslims on the panel. And we actually saw that in a piece in the New York Times, right, about Pamela Geller, talking about all these things, but there was no Muslims in the article, like as if Muslims didn't exist in the United States for us to say, well, let's hear what their perspective is. So, and I think it's also, us as voters in this country, like, we shouldn't be allowing people to run campaigns in our districts that are anti-Muslim. We should be calling these people out at town halls, at, candidate forums. Like, we don't, this doesn't represent our district or whatever it is. It just requires Americans to have some courage to stand up and say this is not acceptable. And what's funny is, like, I'm the first person to do that for anyone in any community. Like, I will be the first person to call out sexism, misogyny, homophobia. And I think it requires some courage. And I sometimes feel like there's a big segment of our population that really does believe that we shouldn't be vilifying an entire faith community, but then they don't have the courage to say that. And the other last point, I think, in the problem that we have in the U.S., that is not that we want to marginalize Muslims, but we think it's a choice we have to make, where we choose between our own personal security and the constitutional rights of some people. So we think to ourselves, well, we'll manage with violating the constitutional rights of a couple of people in our country so that we can all have personal security. And I think that, we've had a famous, white man say, if we either have both or none at all, right? We can't have security without liberty and liberty without security.
Sure.
Or we deserve either of those if we're going to make that choice. So, and so we just require courage, and we require people to treat Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry the same way we would treat anti-Semitism, homophobia in this country, anti-Black racism, any form of, anti-woman. But right now we're not there yet. And I think that we should get there. And I think there's an emerging voice of young American Muslims who have been able to cross the aisles into other communities and are building that solidarity. So hopefully we're trying to block this pathway of getting to be anywhere like the France, because thank God I can still wear hijab and go to public university. I can still work for the government and be Muslim and wear my religious attire, which, as you know, is not something people can do in a place like France.
No, and that's what concerns me. That I'm a hardcore secularist, but secular fundamentalism is certainly a problem. I mean, it's the antithesis of secularism anyway, when you're taking away people's right to religious freedom. But I want to shift gears a little bit. As we discussed earlier, your parents immigrated from Ramallah, Palestine, in the 1970s. Have you been to Israel, Palestine?
I have been to Israel, Palestine many, many times as a Palestinian and as someone who was born to a Palestinian family. I've gotten to see, occupation, firsthand. My family, immediate family, like my grandmother and my aunts and uncles still live in the West Bank of Palestine. So that's also been part of my perspective. And oftentimes, because I am a Palestinian and I am pro-Palestinian, obviously, because I'm pro my own people and their sovereignty and their, and their liberation movement, I've been called many things, and that's been my being Palestinian has actually been translated as a slur against me and people who do the work that I do.
Yeah, I did. There was a new Amnesty International report which came out and said 750,000 Palestinian children are suffering from PTSD and 300,000 are malnourished. Do you get this? Do you get the sense that Americans that no one really gives a shit anymore about the Palestinians?
So I always break that conversation into two things. I have actually seen a lot more solidarity being built around the American public, especially in the recent massacres in Gaza that happened last summer, and just saw more people that have joined that kind of solidarity movement and have stood up and said enough is enough. But I haven't seen, obviously, that same solidarity coming from the actual government and those who have power over foreign policy, as you know. I mean, there were some interesting things, as you saw, that have happened, where members of Congress wouldn't go to a Netanyahu speech, but I don't know if that was because they love Palestinians. It was more about defending the president and his honor. But the solidarity movement internationally has grown immensely. And the BDS, as you know, the BDS movement has picked up a lot of steam in both Europe and the United States, which is driving the kind of, Zionist, supporters crazy. But again, foreign policy has been stagnant and has stayed the same, and we continue to give billions of dollars to Israel every year to maintain what we all know is an illegal occupation.
Yeah, I mean, this BDS movement seems to be gathering steam, which is good. And I now notice that the word apartheid is used in mainstream circles more and more, and not just by the fringe critics of Israeli policy. So, I'm optimistic for the future. But, Linda, it's been awesome having you on here. I love people who defy stereotypes about their demographic. I mean, you blow every stereotype about Muslim women being submissive people that should sit in a corner and don't say anything. I know I've also heard you say there's not a mosque in America you've been turned away from. You're a very powerful voice. You're an important voice. Where can my listeners find you or follow your work?
They can definitely follow me on Twitter, L Sarsour, which is just my last name, and also on Facebook, Linda Sarsour. As you probably know, CJ, I'm a very avid tweeter, and I like to get people to kind of be in my mind where I am, but also physically what I'm doing and what the Muslim community is up to nationally. So feel free to follow me on Twitter. Cool.
Awesome, Linda. No, thanks for having on, and this has been a great chat.
Thank you so much, CJ.
Okay, I'll see you on Twitter. Okay, see you.
All right.
Bye-bye.